All right, well, welcome everybody. Good afternoon. It's a nice rainy, chilly day, so better here than I guess outside. But I want to welcome everybody to our webinar today, or our panel discussion today, a virtual panel discussion, returning to work in the wake of COVID-19, perspectives from leaders in tech, HR, and finance. Very happy today to have the group that we do. I'm really excited about the material and the content that we're going to go over. Before we jump into it, I'd like to do a few things about some housekeeping items. First, we're going to be doing some poll questions today during the webinar. So you'll see poll questions pop up throughout the presentation, throughout the dialogue. We'll have about 4 of these questions. It's just to get a better idea of some of the things that you're seeing and going through, and it'll help us sort of craft some of the conversations so that we can keep it as appropriate as possible to the audience. We have a pretty big audience today, so we want to make sure that we're getting some feedback while we're going through this. When a poll question pops up, you have usually about a minute or so to answer that poll question. They're pretty straightforward, very simple questions. Hopefully they're not too big or too long. Also, if you have any questions, although everyone is on mute because we do have a lot of people that are registered and a lot of attendees today, everyone is on mute, but what we're going to be doing is taking questions from the Q&A section. So on your screen, there'll be a Q&A button, and you can click that and then ask questions. And Katie on our side, who's administering the event and running it for us and doing all the polls, she'll be collecting those questions and merging any of the similar themes that she sees come in, and she'll be passing them over to me. If it's something I can inject into the dialogue when we're talking with the group, I will do that. Otherwise, it'll be something that we might wait till the end on. So if you don't hear a question right away, don't worry, we're gonna try to get to them, but it may just be at a different time, or it may be towards the end of the presentation. But feel free to ask those questions. We really do wanna see some of the things you're interested in and make sure that we can talk about that as well. If you do have any issues, if you have any problems, or say a question's not popping up, or you want to get some answers technically, Katie is able to answer some of those questions via chat. So just raise your hand. There's another icon on your screen to raise your hand. Go ahead and do that, and Katie will be able to chat with you and try to walk through any of those issues in case you need some help. Other than that, like I said, we do have almost 90 respondents today, so we're really excited about it. We already have 53 on board, so we're going to get going here. What we're going to do is quickly, before we jump into the subject, I want to do a really quick introduction with our panel so you know who we're talking to today and who's providing their experience and their expertise on the subject matter. So if I could real quick, first of all, welcome David, Mitch, Mark to the panel. Really excited to talk to you. And if we could go ahead and start maybe with you, David, and get a brief introduction of who you are, and Katie's going to switch us into presentation mode. If you want to see the speakers up close when we're in presentation mode, there's a button in your upper corner that'll switch to speaker view, and speaker view will show you who's talking, and it'll make that screen bigger. So David, if you could briefly introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Brent. Appreciate it. I'm certainly glad to be here and excited to help kind of share our experiences this afternoon with everybody that's part of the webinar. So again, I'm Dave Townsend. I am President and Chief Operating Officer at Awcom. We're a strategic IT services partner, working closely with our clients to really connect their business objectives and business results and strategy, where they're headed as an organization, and how technology is going to help them achieve those objectives. So that's a quick kind of rundown on Awcom. Some of my experience and background is largely in technology, specifically with those specific areas in mind around how organizations can achieve results and the role that technology plays in helping them advance, grow, and scale. And that's where we spend a lot of our time on our clients. I've done that at both large organizations and small organizations, including a number of my former colleagues from Plant Moran that are part of the panel, but also on the call with us this afternoon too. So spent a lot of time there leading, building, and developing IT services for the firm. And so that's a little bit of kind of background on my experience. And again, looking forward to hopefully sharing some great insights and valuable content with you guys today, and you'll walk away with some, I think, some effective takeaways and action items that you can help prepare your organizations with.
Great, thanks. Hey, about Mitch, how about you?
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Mitch Rogers, and I'm a partner with Empower HR. We're a 25-year-old business, Midwest focused, serving to the small to mid-sized business community by delivering integrated human resource solutions. We really focus on getting to what matters most to our customers and then our team holds ourselves relentlessly accountable to those items that drive and deliver results for our customers.
Thanks. And Mark, if you could introduce yourself as well.
Sure. My name is Mark Scovera. I'm a principal with Plant Moran. I'm based out of Southfield. Plant Moran, if you don't know, is the 11th largest accounting firm in the United States. We've got offices in Michigan, Ohio, Illinois, and Colorado. I specialize in financial accounting outsourcing, which provides the accounting department to our clients. You don't want to manage an accounting department. It's not your area of expertise. It's exactly what we look at doing, and I've got a lot of good information today about from a financial perspective what you need to be thinking about coming out of COVID-19, and some good information on the PPP loans as well. So
Great. Thanks, everyone. So let's dive in. So obviously, this pandemic's been terrible. I mean, not just from a health concern standpoint, which of course is terrible as well. But I mean, from a business standpoint, everyone kind of has these concerns, our staffs, our customer, our vendors, the list kind of goes on and on. So one, thank you all for being here, of course. But two, before we really dig into what's coming up, maybe we can take a second to look at today and say, what are some of the things that, we can use today? So I want to kick us off with maybe Mitch, we're looking at, the environment today. Teams are kind of working remotely. They're kind of getting sick and tired of being home. How do we keep people right now engaged? How do we keep them positive during this pandemic?
Yeah, it's a great question, Brent. So, engagement is something that's pervasive in good times and bad. And because we've had so many, changes in the way that we interact with our businesses or in our employees, it's never been more important to understand and integrate engagement with our teams. The byproduct of engagement is higher productivity, higher profitability. We have increased customer satisfaction and happier and healthy employees. So who wouldn't want to subscribe to employee engagement? There's a few tenets within that that we generally use in terms of working with our customers, and that's communication. Got to lead by communication. Identify the who, the how, and the frequency. When the employees are communicated well by their leadership team, it certainly builds trust, right? It helps employees understand the business goals, policies, and organizational changes. There's changes certainly in regards to what's going on in terms of how we communicate with our employees, and David in the Outcom team is certainly well aware of that in terms of using digital markets and new digital platforms to establish your weekly check-ins, your one-on-ones, your team meetings. So understanding what's available to best utilize that. When you're meeting with your teams, setting clear expectations. In today's environment where employees are working remotely, being clear in terms of what your expectations, what their daily tasks should be, how they can bring value to the team in the organization. When employees understand what's expected of them, it's certainly going to increase their motivation, and the opportunity for success is certainly going to increase. If individual goals or business goals are changing, communicate that as well. Employees right now with shortened work hours, or in certainly the slowing down of some businesses, what does that mean for me and my daily responsibilities, and what does that mean for the business? Let me know what that is. Remaining flexible. As an employer right now, it's really important for all of us to understand the flexibility and the challenges that our teams are going through. We've got schools stopping, we've got daycare not available, we've got a lot of pressures going on, some people having to care for family members. So I think working with them and understanding how you can be flexible as an employer is certainly going to increase that gratitude in the value that those employees have, and you understanding and empathizing with their needs. Certainly recognize good work. Everybody loves a pat on the back, right? Everybody loves to know that they brought value to their team and to their organization. So internally, identify with your leadership team how you're going to do that. Will you have company announcements? Will you have team announcements? How are you going to create those shout outs to recognize the people that are really stepping and going above and beyond? Encourage a healthy work at home balance. So I can use my example here. Certainly I'm working from home. My wife works from home. She's occupied the office. She's the CEO of the family. So I'm on the island of the kitchen, right? But the challenge is that, where is that physical break between your personal life and your professional life? I've got computers, I've got papers, I've got notes, everything is on, the island. So, understanding and encouraging employees that, hey, at the end of the day, when it's time to stop, right? Shut the computer off, spend time with your family, and don't get so immersed with feeling like you have to work because it's literally staring you, in the face. And I would say lastly here, Brent, demonstrate a team, culture. As employees are being, as businesses reopening, and then as employees are being brought back to the workforce, you're likely to be bringing them back in phases, right? And so, understanding that those that maybe aren't being pulled back to work or aren't being pulled back to the office right now, they are still an important part of the team. So understanding that, what they're doing out there is valuable, and that they're still part of the team, and you're really creating that, that team unity.
Great. There was a lot there. Appreciate that. I want to come back to some of those items too, because there's a bit to unpack there, I think, in terms of kind of how that plays out going forward as well. We're getting some questions here, but one, from Jeff, who asks, and I'll get into this in a little minute, but he ties into the organization, like operational standpoint as well, and kind of processes. So I do want to come back to you on some of that. There's a lot there. I do want to take a second here, and based on some of the poll, question, or the question that we just asked, and some of the feedback that we get, Mark, I don't know if you saw that, but it seems like a lot of people were pretty frustrated with the whole process surrounding PPP. I know from our standpoint, we were fairly frustrated as well, in kind of how that unfolded. Can you give us a little bit about, PPP, like what's going on with it? Are people getting money? Is it late to apply? Like, can you give us kind of some insight into the PPP as it stands today?
Sure, Brian. Yeah, first of all, it's not too late to apply because just last Friday, an additional 310 billion was made available for PPP loans. People are getting money. I personally have had several clients that have received funds, but be ready for delays and red tape, because this is like drinking from a fire hose. I mean, the banks and the SBA is just not ready for it, and to roll something out this big, this quickly, it's natural to have these types of delays. So if you go into the process expecting it and just being ready to roll with it, I think you're going to be a lot better off. Many banks are, especially the big ones, are turning away customers with whom they don't have an established lending relationship with, not just a banking relationship, but a lending relationship, an existing business loan, line of credit. And I think the reason for that is twofold. Number one, it really cuts down on the potential applicants that they've got to deal with, because pretty much every business owner in the United States, when this thing first rolled out earlier this month, could apply. Second of all, it really kind of gets into the whole Patriot Act situation where they need to know their customer, and it really cuts down on the paperwork if they have that existing lending relationship with you. So if you have an existing lending relationship with a bank, that's probably the best place to start, the one you're going to get the money the quickest from, with the least amount of red tape. Anecdotally, I've heard that the smaller community banks are doing a much better job of getting the money quickly versus the bigger national banks. I've even heard there are some lenders such as PayPal that is now an authorized lender by the SBA to do this. And I've heard that people have had success going to those alternative type lenders. So start with your bank, shop around, and as a last resort, love the national banks, but I think they're just so overwhelmed with applications. I think that's where a lot of the delays and a lot of the problems have come from. And then once you do get the money, and I think the best practice is to deposit the money into a separate account so you can account for it separately, because there's been a lot of additional guidance that has come in recent days, and I'm sure there's more to come about how to get the forgiveness on the loan. And even talking about, the Treasury Secretary said the other day that any organization that gets over $2 million in PPP funds would be subject to an audit. So you want to make sure that right off the bat you maintain that paper trail. And the best way to do that is to deposit the money right off the bat into a separate account and track those expenditures.
So, and I want to hit one more follow-up with you, Mark, before we move over to David, because I do want to, like I said, talk about a few different concepts up front. But, from your standpoint, are people saying to you it was worth it to go through the process? I mean, and is it worth it? Should people be looking at it now that the additional funds were released, if they haven't done PPP yet, but say they're in a situation where they need to keep employees on, and they're running with some cash flow issues? I mean, is it an experience that they should think about going through?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And I think the way to look at it like this, I preach a pragmatic approach. I mean, if you're looking at your only alternative, absent of these funds, would be to lay off your employees, reduce salaries, reduce headcount, then yes, it's absolutely worth the red tape. But if you have other resources available, or your business conditions don't warrant you to lay off employees, then it's probably not. It's not the free for all that it seemed to be at the beginning of the month that a lot of companies took advantage of. But it's definitely worth it if your only alternative is to lay off your employees or reduce their salaries.
Okay, great, thank you. So Dave, this whole thing kind of seemed like a shotgun, right? I mean, everything was going along as fairly normal, and as far as business concerned, and then all of a sudden, everybody is, for the most part, remote, except for essential, employees in essential businesses. It wasn't really a planned transition for a lot of businesses. What have we've heard things about data security. We've heard things about Zoom having vulnerabilities, although a lot have been patched now. We've heard about people are throwing files everywhere and sharing everywhere. I mean, what are the implications of that? What are we sitting on right now? Is this are we elevating risk in our businesses right now, just operating?
Yeah, well, yeah, the short answer is yes, for sure. And I think security is a component of it. I think we talked a little bit about it with Mitch and some of the operational changes. It's become a disruption to business in the way we're operating today, and largely because this transition wasn't planned. Nobody's gone through a world pandemic before, figuring out how to run businesses in 2020, given the environment that we're operating in today. So given all of that complexity and the constant change that's gone on in this situation, we've all just been forced into a situation of obviously having to figure it out and make it work. And anytime an organization's had challenges with how they have operated before, how they organize meetings, how they collaborate on documents, what their existing security framework is, all those kind of things just get amplified, right? It's like a golfer that's got a golf swing under stress when he's in the final round of the Masters. Any kind of little flaws he's got is going to come out on that Sunday afternoon. So it's similar from a business standpoint. And I think you said it in your question, which it's not really a planned transition. So how do we react? I think looking at it going forward, I think we have to think about this as a phased approach of what's going to happen. I don't think on May 18th, on that Monday, when I do think things will be more opened up and starting to come back online, I don't think it's a light switch. I think it's a phased approach, and I think we need to be preparing our organizations for that. From a security standpoint, that certainly is always a key component, right? It ought to be a cornerstone of everything you're doing. Hackers are looking for opportunities all the time. And in the case of Zoom, you mentioned a little bit, they went through exponential growth and all these new users onto their platform. Hackers were going to find that and expose any kind of security holes, including even data that's, routing through China. So that has been resolved through some of their latest application updates. So if you haven't applied that, certainly do that. And even in this webinar itself, we're able to control the data and content servers that it's flowing through, which is just out of North America. So we can select US and Canada. So from a security standpoint, yeah, lots of differences, right? And whether it be the Zoom meetings that hackers are taking advantage of, or even things like knowing that everybody's at home and their home network is an extension of now their business and corporate environment. That home network is not as fortified and secured as what it is in the corporate world. So there's certainly opportunities there as well. So it's something that you have to be mindful of. And some of the best practices on that are communicating with your staff, making sure they understand what it means to be able to set up Wi-Fi security at their house, what those expectations are, and what they're doing in terms of work standpoint, being from a corporate controlled laptop or desktop, I guess, if they've dragged it home to be able to work remotely. A lot of other things in there. I won't dive too much into it yet, but I think there's some discussion to be had around, what's happening with the tools that we need to go face to face to operate effectively in different meetings. How do we effectively use video? How do we better track action items and who's accountable for doing what? All those operational kind of components that get kind of come out of that as a part of this process and get exposed and need to get improved are a combination of process and technology that's got to get connected there.
Great, thanks, Dave. Yeah, and I'm seeing kind of a theme here that I want to touch back upon in a little bit. And I wanted to at least address kind of what's going on today from a couple different avenues, but I do want to get into kind of what what we're here for. And, that is, really about the regulations in Michigan seem like they're about to be loosened up a little bit. It seems like there's a date thrown out there about, May 15th and more businesses are open today, as well as will be, potentially opened up then. Obviously there's going to be a number of restrictions post that date. But what can we expect now? And feel free to everyone to kind of chime in on this one through your unique view. But do you see some businesses kind of going full at it and getting going again and pulling everyone back in the office? Some staying completely remote. I mean, what do you anticipate happening on the 15th that we should be probably prepared or aware for?
I can start off on that one. I think it's a partial startup, right? I kind of started to hint at that. I think even the scenario of, organizations are going to have people that still have childcare responsibilities. So one of the parents responsible for doing that, if they're working full time, their kids are not going back to school. So you have that element going on. You have an element of people that are going to be a higher risk, given their own personal health condition or that of the family members, and they're not going to feel comfortable coming back in. So you're going to have a mix of people that are going to be challenged to just come right back in and start to work. You also have the situation when some places are going to be, to do social distancing. If your office was already pretty constrained with space and people and the density ratio that was there, that's even more difficult to do now if you can't be all working in the same conference room or next to each other at a desk. So I think that's going to force us into a situation of having to think about continuing some type of remote workforce, whether it be certain departments or areas of the company that can effectively do that work remotely, while others that are more essential to performing tasks on site are able to come into the office to be able to do that.
And Mitch, how about from your standpoint? Does that seem fairly, I guess it seemed like you'd approach it the same way. I mean, and do you feel like that's kind of the way it's going to go with companies coming back in? And how do you do that? How do you pull people in different ways like that?
Yeah, so we serve a variety of customers in a lot of different market segments, and so we've seen some business segments that have actually accelerated their work, and they're producing more now than pre-COVID, albeit that we're in the exception, but there are some, and then we've got others that have run the gamut from being able to conduct or continue business remotely to others who've had significant reductions in force. I saw a question that Jeff answered earlier that kind of transcends into this a little bit in terms of like when business operations have been forced for interruption, interacting with their teams and things of that nature. So first, if the organization hasn't begin to communicate with their employees who are not working, right? Give them the update. What is going on? What do you know? Give them information so at least they can digest that and they can understand perhaps what the next steps. And even if the answer is some of which we don't know, but we will get back to you next week or establish a cadence so people just feel more comfortable and they're not in a dark cloud, right? And then now it becomes, okay, well, now we've got businesses that are either focused on reopening or focused on returning employees to an office environment. Yes, we think it's going to be a phase. It's not going to be, a flick the switch and everybody, gets back. We would encourage that, employers designate a pandemic community or committee, I should say. and that reflects different roles within the business. So as they're making decisions on how to either reopen or bring employees back to the office, that they've got perspective from different roles, and people have a voice. So as the plan is being laid out, not only are you articulating or describing what those new or changed policies are, but you also have an explanation in terms of how you were able to come to those decisions. And then your employees feel that, members or peers within their team, within their profile, had a voice in that as well. We also request or suggest a return to work list. And this would include not just aspects of human resources, but in the entire business. And there are a lot of checklists that are available online. Our team is in the final draft stages of developing one for our customers that we feel are best practices based on what we see and experience, through their lens. But it's very meticulous, and it's not a checklist that should be developed to make everybody feel good, but it's a checklist that really needs to be followed and practiced by all. And then I would also say that employers need to define what that new norm is as it relates to different policies within the organization. And some examples to that could be telework and commuting, right? Which roles can continue to telecommute and which roles can't. Also empathizing with employees that may have to commute and use public transportation to get to work, and some of the fears and challenges around it. So understanding and revisiting policies to affect that. Expect more sick leaves. Employees are going to be caring for kids. They're not going to be able to go to school. Daycare has been minimized. You've got family members that are potentially getting impacted by the virus. And so expect more requests and some leniency, around that, and design a policy that isn't so, hardcore what it may have used to be. You have to be at the office at 8 or you have to leave at 5. Loosen those rules up a little bit. Certainly COVID safety policies, the social distancing, in that respect, I think a lot of us, at least from my perspective, I'm a toucher, right? I'm a hugger, I knuckle pump, I do a lot of those things. And so I think as people start to get back into the workforce, they're going to go back to the instinctive behavior that's been ingrained in their DNA, right? I'm a high five, I'm a hugger. And, I played golf this weekend with a group of guys, and yes, we did respect the social distancing rules, but I made a mistake. 2 seconds in, I pulled my car up to next to my buddy's car. I got out and I immediately gave him the high five, and it was one of those awkward moments. And I think, you've got to reinforce that. I heard a friend that they're incorporating within their workstations a no handshake sign, right? Like by their desk. So it's just one of those things that retrains the mind, right? To get away from, the handshake when guests are coming in or when you're, meeting, your colleague. And then lastly, I would say, travel policies, really restricting business travel to essential travel and identifying like what that means and for whom.
Great, thanks. Mark, how about you? So, I'm getting kind of the feedback here from not only is there kind of a technology standpoint, things are going to change and be a little different. That's going to prevent some barriers as people are moving into this. From a people standpoint, is there, from a financial standpoint, I mean, our companies, I know that we didn't necessarily, because the services that we provide, and we have to get out there and create mobility for people, that we were running as well as we could, by keeping everyone employed and out and productive and not really in the office anymore, but working remotely. So our financials, we could try and keep as close to as normal as we could, but that's just not the reality of most businesses out there. I mean, people had to take some big swings in how they manage expenses, and they're still doing it right now. How do you just turn that on? How do you just come back into the office?
Yeah, I think the short answer is you can't. And I think businesses, for the most part, are going to take a cautious approach. And I think there's a lot of uncertainty out there right now about the where, the when, and the how. When we first had the work at home order come down, many of my clients contacted me that very first week. I mean, almost immediately after the shutdown, to help them with doomsday cash flow scenarios and ways they could make their cash last the longest. I think coming out of it, there are even more scenarios and variables to consider. For example, if you run a restaurant, you don't know what it's going to look like. I mean, will you be allowed to operate at 25%, 50%, or 100% of capacity? I mean, that's going to affect your cash flow right off the bat. Other considerations, like how will your supply chain be affected? Will you be able to purchase all of the food that you used to, and will it arrive reliably, and how much will they need? Because again, they don't know, how many customers they're going to have, because even if they're allowed to operate at 50%, does that mean people are going to feel comfortable enough to go out to a restaurant again? I don't know. Will they have to invest in testing kits for their employees or their customers? And what type of personal protection equipment will businesses have to invest in? You're going to need the gowns, the caps, the gloves, the masks. Manufacturer may have similar concerns about supply chain, the PPE for employees, capacity. So it's very similar to a restaurant. On the other hand, an attorney's office may have different concerns. For example, what they will control in their office versus being mandated by the government. Like Dave said, if they have tight quarters, they may be restricted into how many people can be in the office. What situation will their clients be in coming out of this? Do they need to adjust their marketing to target prospective clients differently? What's their specialty, and how is it affected by COVID-19? And most importantly, for like a professional services firm, will the talent pool for hiring be the same quality after we go back to work? I mean, what will that look like? And I think that's a big concern for somebody that's an attorney's office. So, basically, long story short, I think different companies have different concerns depending on what business you're in, and you not only have to look at it differently for different businesses, but each business has to have a variety of scenarios, because I think there's going to be more uncertainty than ever coming out of this. And for how long is it going to last?
Oh, that's great. There was a question from Julie here, which I think is pretty applicable. She had asked, can you offer any real high level kind of cash flow tips, for people that are coming into this, maybe as a way to kind of manage this from a cash flow perspective, or things that you would suggest or recommend, coming into this?
Sure. In the simplest form, that I can suggest from a high level would be, if you have a budget, start with that. And critically review your budget first and say, okay, what do I need? What are needs? What are wants? And what are these numbers going to look like under different scenarios? And then look at what your starting cash balance is, and roll through all the expenditures in any given month, adding in your cash receipts, and basically coming up with a what if ending cash balance. And then you can take a look and see where the pressure points are in the year, especially if your budget is not just peanut butter spreading everything across 12 months. If you really take a look at it, say, okay, I've got big insurance payments coming up in July, so you put all that in July, and that way where your pressure points are. The other thing that I would suggest is you always add at least 5%, maybe 10% at the bottom, just for cushion, for the stuff that comes up that you're not thinking about or not planning on. And then that way you've always made sure that you've got a good cushion in cash. So do it, set it up that way, know where the pressure points are, and then you'll look at alternative ways to raise money, either through the PPP, a business loan, maybe some debt, or whatever resources you have available to yourself to cover the shortfalls.
Okay, thanks, Mark. I have a few more questions for you in terms of that. You've kind of brought that up on the PPP side, but let me get to Dave for a second here for questions about where we're at today, and then I'm going to come back. I want to come back to you too, Mitch, about a couple of things that you had mentioned. So, Dave, and everyone, like we said, kind of limped into this a little bit, not really expecting it. Some of the just, adjustments that they made from a technology perspective, well, how do I get it done today, right? But now it's looking like everyone feels this is, the going back to business as normal is either going to take a bit longer than we maybe thought, or it's not really going to get back to how it was before. So, how does this change, the technology setup for people? If are they lugging machines back and forth? I mean, what does this mobile world kind of look like, given that it's not a short term 1 month and we're back to the office? This could be 3, 4, 5 months. We don't know.
Yeah, there's certainly still a lot of unknown. I can tell you this. I think going into this, I would have been highly confident that Occam was ready for a complete remote workforce and doing what we needed to do to be effective. And largely we have been, especially with tools and some process things we already had in place. But experiencing it in the real live world during the situation, I know we have opportunities to grow and expand on that even more. There's a lot of things organizations need to be doing, but I think the key to some of this is thinking about this broader than just the May 15th orders being lifted and things are back to normal, because I think the reality for most is it's going to be some kind of mixed environment, meaning some people are still going to be remote, and now we're going to have more people in the office. And that changes the dynamics of how work is done and how technology is leveraged. So we're going to come through another transition. And we've got about 2 weeks to prepare for that next transition into this next phase, which it really is this, what I think about as kind of being a mixed environment. And so if, for example, you mentioned laptops or desktops, are they bringing those home? But if you brought a desktop home to work with remotely, that's great. But if you're going back and forth because you're working in the office 2 days a week and 3 days a week at home, that probably doesn't work so well. Some of the other things we touched on were, communication. I think getting a tool like Teams from Microsoft or Slack is critical to be able to have that instant communication with team members and connect with them through video. I know video for us and a number of our clients and other organizations we've spoken to has been very, very well received and had a huge impact on just keeping people connected and working together and ongoing team building and culture as well. So video, I think, has been a critical aspect of it. And I think a third component besides just, some kind of that real-time communication is the document collaboration. We talked a little bit about that before. So whether that be like a SharePoint or Google Docs or something along those lines that allows people to work from a central place. If you're still doing something from a file server, that can be really painful. I know you got VPN likely in place and you can connect to those documents, but that's not the most collaborative experience. It probably does okay when everybody's in the office. It's a different experience when they're spread out and not connected or sitting next to each other. So some of those kind of considerations I think people have to be thinking about. And maybe one last component, I touched a little bit on the video, but even from a video standpoint, think about a mixed environment is different than when everyone's remote. If everybody's remote, everyone's using their webcam. But if you've got a mixed environment, now you've got a few people in the office and they still need to connect and work in a meeting with 4 or 5 other people that might be remote. That's a different use case and a different scenario. And so being prepared in the office to have webcam video set up in most, if not all, the conference rooms, I think is almost a must-have today. There's a couple of good ones out there. Logitech makes some of the lower end, less expensive ones. There's a device called the Owl, which is a great unit, and it's literally makes it really simple for everybody to connect in video because it uses the same tools you're already used to, whether that be a Teams or Slack or Skype or Zoom or whatever's working for your organization. It's just really plugging that USB into a laptop with somebody that's in the room, and now everybody that's remote can see a 360 view of the room as well as anybody who's speaking. So thinking about some of those facility things from a video standpoint, I think is really important because again, the use case changes as we go through this next transition, and we got to focus on what are those transition items, and then what do we need to do to get better at our operations and connecting those process and technology components.
Thanks, Dave. And I will, I'm trying to pop around, I want to ask everyone a few questions. I want to dig into some of, your expertise, obviously. I just to let everyone kind of in the audience know, there's going to be no way, I think, for us to cover the amount of information probably that we have here. There's a lot of info here. So I think what we're going to continue to do is as things keep coming out, as regulations keep coming out, we're probably going to offer more of these and dig in a little bit more specifically as we go and get at more information as well, just to let everybody know. If you have questions, keep them coming in. I do see them coming in. These are great questions. At the end, we can sit and just go through a lot of the questions. We have some extra time at the end, but for those that are on a schedule, I kind of want to get through some more items here that we have, and then we'll get to the questions at the end. For anyone who wants to stay with us for a little longer, we can go through some of those questions as well. So I do want to take an opportunity Mitch, you brought up a lot kind of in the beginning here that I wanna dig into. But one of the things that you had talked about from a culture standpoint, from an engagement standpoint, was just the differences between how things were in the office as now how things kind of are remotely. There was also a question that came in around that, and what are some tips around or managing culture? Actually, one of the polls came back and said that was a challenge for a lot of people. So how do you re-engage this workforce? How do you go from right now we're communicating somewhat limitedly because it's not like it used to be, or at least it feels limitedly. How do we change that? How do we engage people? How do we get them back into the office? What should we do? And how do we bring people back in the office when it's appropriate?
Yeah, sure. So, I would say that bringing people back to the office, if you have an environment that can support remote employees, then I would say that you want to bring back those employees to the office that absolutely have to be there, right? And for those who can continue to work remote, allow them to work remote, and as you bring employees back, you're going to get more comfortable with the policies that you've established, right? Employees are going to get more comfortable with the new norm, so to speak, and then you can, certainly bring in, other team members as time allows. The communication, I can't reemphasize, how businesses and its leaders, communicate with its employees. And David shared, a bunch of digital vehicles in order to do that. I can speak internally. So, our business has remained, fully operational. In fact, our teams have never worked, more hard in the 10 years that we've owned the business. But, communicating, our leaders communicating with their teams, we do it on a daily basis, right? So we've used Zoom or some other vehicles in order to do that, but it's daily check-ins, right? How's the team doing? Are there any concerns about work, any concerns about their personal life? Just empathizing and taking that in as a leadership group. Is there anything that we can do to help mitigate, fear or concerns, for those employees? This is a stressful time, right? And so for employees and for businesses, and that ranges from high stress to something less than that. But we've tried to create a fun environment, right? And so to create that team camaraderie, we have morning coffee hours, right? So we have 4 regions: Wisconsin, Illinois, Ohio, and Michigan. So we'll have regional coffee hours, we'll have regional happy hours, we'll have team moments, and so like involving the team in reinforcing the culture, in the mission and the values, right? Keeping everybody focused on that, because your values and missions shouldn't be changing, and so reinforcing what that is really important in terms of establishing that comfort and that integration with the employees. I talked earlier about certainly the checklists in the committee, designed to bring employees back to work. Having what that meticulous process is going to be, followed by all, is certainly going to be really important. And then as you go through the company policies, there are going to be some that you do need to make changes on, and again, effectively communicating those to the employees. We had a situation, actually. It was one of my friends that I was with this Saturday on the golf course. Here's an example of what's not good communication. So he and other team members got a text on Friday that the business was going to be going operational on Monday and be at work at XYZ time, right? So that created a lot of questions. It created fear, concerns, right? What is my workplace environment going to look like, right? What's expected of me? So I would say that's probably one of the poorest communications that I've heard of. So in terms of communicating clearly, frequently, I think that's really going to be in certainly the business's best interest.
And you had mentioned there some policies that will need to be adjusted. Can you give us some suggestions on kind of what are those policies that we're going to need to implement, or what are the policies you envision will have to address, either as people come back or as they're working remotely?
Sure. So workplace safety, recall procedures, if there's any relationship or impact to employee benefits and their eligibility, remote work policies, compensation, business continuity, and then I mentioned earlier some areas around telecommuting, telework, I should say, the COVID safety policy, social distancing, PPE, temperature checks, symptoms monitoring. So that's an area where a lot of businesses are what is that daily check-in, right? The self-reporting of the employees. Do I have symptoms? Am I feeling sick? If so, you can't come to work. You have to go home. And then there's period of times based on the symptoms, whether you have had a fever or just not feeling well, periods of time that you need to stay away from the workforce. And that leadership team, somebody has to own that, and somebody has to diligently manage that without exception. If an employee identifies him or herself as not feeling well, you got to hit the go home button.
And are there, on that note, I mean, realistically, there could be an environment where an employee needs the job and they're just not going to be truthful, maybe, about self-diagnosing symptoms. What kind of policy do you have in place to kind of manage some of the risk there that you're exposing other employees to?
Yeah. So, in terms of communicating what's expected of employees, we've often worked in a world where, hey, I'm just going to grit and grind it, right? I'm not feeling well. I'm going to go to my office and because I've got to do my job, and I'm going to suffer a little bit, but I'm going to get my work done. Even pre-COVID, there were many employees that just didn't feel comfortable with that. I've got to sit side by side or stand side by side with him or her, and he or she's not feeling well. I don't want to catch that. Certainly in the light of COVID, employees have to understand that you cannot come to work. Now, there's a sick leave, Michigan State sick leave, where employees will be protected from an income standpoint. And then there's also, the family medical leave that's been expanded as well. So, it does protect employees who are not well, where their compensation can still be continued.
Mitch, I have a question along the lines of the self-reporting health screening. I know Brent's job's asked questions, but I have one anyway. Related to that, Oakland County and Wayne County, at least both have required that during this time, essential employees have to do that health screening and self-report on temperatures and different symptoms and so forth like that. Have you heard anything if that will continue, or is that going to be a requirement as part of this get back to work after the 15th timeframe?
Yeah, so a lot of that is still fluid, which makes it confusing for a lot of businesses. And so there's been some CDC recommendations or guidance, I should say, in terms of returning to work. They presented that to the White House. The White House has not yet returned with federal activities or legislation around return to work. As you mentioned, a couple of counties, there is some guidance going on at the county level, and certainly at the state level, which again just adds to the complexity for employers who have employees in different states. So not right now, as it relates to like you said, the non-essential.
Yeah, I know even from a technology standpoint, we ended up developing just in Microsoft Forms, an online electronic form for people to submit, because the manual process is almost impossible with everybody working every different locations, plus the idea of everyone congregating in one place to fill out a form and all using the same pen and filling out all the paper just doesn't make sense either. So I know there's a lot of challenges around that, and I think organizations are eager to figure out what that guidance is going to be.
It's something to add to, relative to OSHA and, workforce protection for employees. So there was a group of senators that submitted some recommendations relative to workplace safety, extended workplace safety for employees. That's currently being, evaluated by OSHA, but we're anticipating that there will be some broadened protections for employees as it relates to COVID. But it's still TBD.
Sure.
All right, I want to, if you don't mind shifting gears a little bit, Mark, I had some follow-up questions from you, especially, it looked like there was a number of people that responded around the PPP. And I'm curious as to, if these funds are released and when these funds are released, how are we supposed to account for these? It seems like there's just a lot of confusion around how we're supposed to track this or what it means or how we're supposed to manage these funds. Could you share a little insight into that?
Sure, sure. As I said earlier, depositing the funds in a separate bank account. The goal there being to avoid the need for extensive research on your part to document qualifying expenditures because, for the forgiveness application, you're going to need documentation. That's abundantly clear. Track expenditures carefully. For example, the PPP allows you to spend no more than 25% on like mortgage, rent, utilities type expenses. And so you have to be able to document that. You need to keep track of spreadsheets for full-time equivalents in your weekly payroll and make sure that you have those detailed spreadsheets that itemize covered expenses, gross to net pay breakdowns of employee compensation, any wage reductions, full-time equivalent headcount on a weekly basis. Those would just be a few examples, the things that we'd recommend that you maintain. And we suggest, as a firm, our guidance has been to launch a PPP treasury management process to track and properly record all disbursements. It's clear in the in the regulations that you can't use the money, for example, to pay down existing debt. And so, we've had questions from clients that have a sweep account set up. So what happens when they deposit the money into their account and it gets swept to pay down their debt? Again, just another reason for you to have, a separate bank account. And I think, there's other considerations too. If you're getting the money from a bank other than the one that you have a lending relationship with, you need to let that lender know that you're borrowing the money because many debt agreements have prohibitions in them or limitations, or at least you need to let them know that you're taking on additional debt because you may run into problems with your original lender. Make sure that you're not using the money for anything other than payroll and mortgage, rent, utilities, because there's been guidance that suggests that there'd be additional penalties for using the funds for items other than payroll and the approved expenses, up to and including criminal penalties for borrowers. So I think they're starting to put some teeth into the forgiveness process because there were a lot of companies when it first kind of came out. That was, like I said, it was just a free for all, and then all of a sudden, these rules came out. You see articles with companies such as like Ruth's Chris or the Los Angeles Lakers that got these funds. They're now returning them. So there's additional teeth in here. And I've talked to clients as well, clients and non-clients alike. Well, okay, the rules say this. So if I do this and I wiggle around this corner and I twist it around this way, I'll be all right, right? Well, maybe not. Again, it's like you look at it, if you have no alternative other than to lay off employees or reduce salaries, this is a vehicle for you to avoid having to do that. And if that's the position that you're in, I think you can sign all the documents in good faith that you'll use the money for the intended purposes, keep the people on the payroll, because that's the ultimate goal of the program, to keep employees on the payroll and off the unemployment rolls. That's what Congress intended. Overall, at the highest level, if that's what you're doing, I think you'll be okay.
What's the risk? It sounds like, when they're putting additional teeth in here and additional penalties or restrictions, at the end of the day, if they come and they say, okay, we're not forgiving anything, do you think that they're going to apply additional penalties on top of not forgiving these loans based on kind of what you're seeing?
Yeah, and I think that's exactly the teeth that they're putting out there, because absent of that guidance, the worst case scenario was, okay, I get no forgiveness, I use it for operations or something else, and all I have to do is pay it back with a 1% interest rate. That's a great deal. Well, I think somebody in Congress figured out that, okay, well, that's not what we intended, so that's why the additional teeth. And they gave, and so if you have the money and you're not feeling really good about these good faith covenants that you made when you sign the papers, and you see now that the rules have changed, they've given a blanket clearance to anybody that has the money that returns it before May 7th, and no questions asked type of thing. So again, the SBA has been pretty clear on forgiveness that no supporting documentation equals no loan forgiveness, and I really can't stress that enough.
Great, that's good to know. Um, and I'm curious, is there any, and you kind of went over this a little bit, but if I'm making the decision and I'm saying, okay, what are the big indicators that, yeah, I really shouldn't be, I should hit them up on that May 7th date and then tell them, nope, we can't really use this as anticipated. Are there any kind of red flags or warning signs that that's kind of the case?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, if you could take a look at it and you could answer honestly that, you know what, I could keep these employees on and not suffer a hardship. And yeah, I mean, meaning that you've got alternative funds or another source of capital that you could easily tap into. Those are the types of things, that they look at. And if you've got over $2 million of this money, you're going to be subject to an audit. And those are the types of things that they're going to be looking at in addition to your documentation of the expenses, when they audit you. So um, those are the types of honesty questions that you need to be honest with yourself about, when you take a look at this. And they pretty much drew a line in the sand with any company that's private equity owned or a public company, because they said it's pretty clear that those types of companies do have avenues to liquidity that don't include the PPP loan, that other small businesses may not have access to. And so they pretty much made it clear that if you're private equity owned or a publicly owned company, that you probably should not apply for the PPP.
Appreciate that. That's good insight. I know we're running short on time. I do want to hit, maybe one general question for the audience or for the panel here, and then we'll let everyone kind of break, and we'll go through the questions that we have building up here. But if you could take one thing away from this, what would be your, your advice to anybody, or what do you think that was one of the most important areas that we kind of discussed today that somebody could take from this, as they're moving forward into the kind of the post-COVID world here? Mitch, why don't you start, and then we'll go Mark, and then Dave.
Sure. A big theme in a lot of what I've talked about today or shared is just communicating with your employees, those who might be active and remote, those who may be laid off, but communicating with them, often will certainly lessen, the fear that, that they have. I would also say that don't go it alone, right? A lot of what David, what Mark have all discussed, is very complex in nature, right? And there's a lot of moving pieces. A lot of this is fluid. And a lot of this is, what might be out there, but needs to be applied specifically, to your business. So if you need help, I would say ask for help. And one last thing, relative to the scope of human resources as it relates to returning employees back to work, we covered, some high level topics, but we also have a webinar that we're conducting next week, May 6th at 11 o'clock Eastern time. And it's going to be led by members of our human resource team, great professionals. And it's going to be an hour-long, super deep dive on all things that we touched on at a high level.
Mark, what do you think? What's the one thing they should, everyone should leave with from you today? And then and then I'll get into some of the other questions that have come in.
Sure. I've got a couple. They're short, but I think number one, as far as the PPP goes, make sure that you keep your funds in a separate account, track expenditures carefully, only use up to 25% of the funds on mortgage, rent, utilities, and the remainder on payroll. Make sure that you're true to the good faith covenants you made up front. Remember, no supporting documentation equals no loan forgiveness. And then, develop, at least coming out of this, an 8-week cash flow with various scenarios, so that you know what you're looking at, where the pressure points are, so that you can be prepared to weather the storm.
Dave, how about you?
Yeah, real quick, I think from my standpoint, I think it's really expanding your time horizon and think bigger than just what May 18th brings. I think it's an opportunity to figure out how organizations can work in a more mixed remote workforce and people in the office. And I think there's a huge upside to that, to being effective, significantly more effective in how work is going to get done. And I think the objective in organizations, when you think about it, being how do we work in a way that work is completely fluid, regardless of the workforce location? And I mean completely fluid, like nothing changes, right? I'm not having to deal with forwarding my cell phone for my phone calls, or lugging equipment home, or whatever it might be. It is completely fluid no matter where I do the work from. I can be just as productive and effective from any of those locations. Certainly for situations like knowledge workers and those in offices, that makes sense. I get it from a manufacturing or other situations where you have to physically be there. But I'd really challenge those groups that can do that type of work to figure out how do they get to that level.
Great. Well, I do want to say thank you to everybody, for their time. I want to thank the panel from all of your time as well. Like I said, we know we're sensitive to everybody's schedules. It's 3 o'clock. That's when we were going to wrap. I knew we weren't going to get through everything. It's quite a large subject matter to kind of dig in and unpack. So we're going to stick around for a little bit. I'm gonna fire off some questions that came in. Everyone, feel free to stick around if you want to. Otherwise, thank you all very much for coming and attending. And we'll send out information related to more of these that we're going to do to dive a little deeper into certain subjects that we found, a lot of interest from. So thanks again, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So I'm gonna just go through some questions that we had here. One of them, that Raymond had asked while you were talking, Mark, was, is there any guidance on the restrictions of the PPP forgiveness for employees who make 100,000? He said, do you look at the individual's pay for each pay period and annualize to see if they exceed the 100K threshold, or do you take all of the 8-week pay and annualize it to see if it exceeds the threshold? It would come into play for commission salesperson who may have one pay period under the 100 and then from one where it may be over the 100.
Yeah, I think the measurement is the 12 months prior if they're over 100. So your measurement was March 1st of 2019 to February 29th, 2020. In that measurement period, if anybody was over 100,000, that's where you'd have to discount your payroll, because where that comes into play is when you calculate the loan amount. And then, the forgiveness, of course, then would be, based on that amount, anything that would be over in the 8-week period ratably on an annual basis, anything over $100,000. But I do caution you to pay attention to any updates on the forgiveness, because it seems like every day there's something new coming out on that.
I have a question, Dave, maybe as your COO hat can field this one. This one was from Jeff earlier, and it was when workforces go remote, many people discovered there's breakages in kind of operations, especially in coordination with the people. How do you plug these, as you come out of this pandemic environment, some of the operational gaps that you found, while you made the transition?
Well, I think one of the things, along those lines is I recommend talking to your team about what's worked well and what's not, and identify some of those opportunities. So I think it's a great way to collect some feedback and understand what barriers the team faced working in the situation. So that'd be one thing to help discover some of those along the lines of how you resolve some of those issues. I think you understand what the process is, and is it a process that's broken? Is it a technology that's not working in conjunction with that process as everyone's gone remote? But there's obviously a lot of tools out there to try to help facilitate that. And we mentioned a little bit about Teams. We didn't get to talk to some of the other tools, but even like tools like Microsoft Planner, that's going to be switched over and be called Tasks pretty soon, is a great way to organize meeting structures and tasks, and who's following up on what items, and have some clear accountability as to what needs to get done. So having some structure around those meetings, if before all this happened, everyone was just in your organization was just getting together and meeting and talking and giving status updates, and there wasn't a lot of structure and organization to it, and the meetings probably weren't very effective. I think the situation amplified that, right? And so those are the ones you're discovering, and how do you get better at doing that? I think you get organized with what the structure of those meetings are, what the purpose is, who's accountable for doing what items, and how you're working together with all that.
Great. I have a question for you, Mitch. And I want to mention to anybody else who's on the line, I know there's still quite a few participants here. If you want to ask questions, go ahead and hit the Q&A and drop them in, and hopefully we can get through all of them. Be happy to ask anything that you're thinking about. Mitch, you talked a lot about the putting new policies in place, and as people are coming in, we have to do these checks, and we have to sit 6 feet apart, and we need to obviously cough into our arms. All of these things. How do you address the policies to protect the business, protect the employees, but also not create fear for coming back to work?
Yeah, that's a great question. Relative to assembling the team to assemble those policy changes or new policies that are being added, I mentioned earlier, and I just want to reinforce it. I think it's important that you're getting a cross section of different employees in different roles, and it's not just made by pure leadership, right? And then certainly as those changes are made, the explanation and the reasons behind it, when employees have information and they can digest it, it's certainly going to contribute to lessening fear. I'm not going to say that it's going to eliminate it, because everybody views and digests things differently, but some of these changes are going to be, in essence, pure compliance changes, right? Other changes are just going to be safety changes, right? And so as you roll out these plans, and you're not just saying what these changes are, but why these changes are being made, certainly people will be able to embrace that. And then you can also share that based on some of those policy adjustments, that it was made by a committee in representation of the entire business.
Great. Mark, I have a couple questions for you. One a little bit earlier on from Julie was, are there pros and cons to negotiating grace periods with, say, vendors or creditors, as well as responding to clients who may request the same from you?
Sure. And I think that each one of those situations you have to look at separately and on a case by case basis. And from a vendor creditor standpoint, you need to look at how critical is the supply to you, and what's the response on the other end. So if it's a critical supply and their initial response is absolutely no way, no how, then you might just need to back off and pay it as it's incurred under normal terms. However, if there's some wiggle room, or it's maybe a less critical supply, you can work and negotiate with them a bit, and come to a happy medium. I would never say not pay somebody at all, and take it upon yourself and make that unilateral decision. But certainly maybe delaying a little bit in terms of when you pay. If you normally pay in 30 days, maybe pay in 45 days, or if you normally pay 45, 60, that type of thing. I think that's normal in this environment. From the cash receipt side, when you have clients coming to you asking you for the same thing, again, I think you have to take it on a case by case basis. How important is the client to you? I think the more important they are to you, the more you're going to want to work with them. If it's small dollar client, and you may want to make an executive decision, or it's a client that maybe has been giving you problems and challenges over the years, you may want to be less lenient with them. Again, it's on a case by case basis. But for the most part, I'd say generally speaking, unless you've got a good reason not to, I think in this environment there's no reason not to try to work with somebody on both ends.
Just a couple more for you that came in. So, if, for example, you have a line of credit and you think you're going to utilize your entire line, but you're still worried about cash flow issues due to slow paying customers, for an example, we were just talking about, do you advise applying for the PPP in that situation? And why would you in that situation, or why wouldn't you?
Yeah, again, I mean, and if just with those facts and circumstances, if your only concern is paying suppliers, I would not go, to the PPP. The PPP is very clear about it's for payroll, mortgage, rent, utilities. There are other products out there. There's the economic industry disaster loan, the EIDL, and then there's the Main Street Lending Program. Two other government programs that are out there in the marketplace that have other purposes, and you may want to look at those things as well. And then two, If you're been a good customer of the bank and you maybe need an extension on your line of credit or a temporary increase on your line of credit, they may be open to that as well. But those are just a couple of the other avenues. But if it's for paying suppliers, I would not look toward the PPP.
Right. And then one final one before we mark here. This comes from Rebecca. They received a $9,000 grant under the EIDL. And they understand this is a grant will not need to be paid back, even if we decide not to take a loan if it's offered to us. Is that correct? Will we need to verify our uses for it? So for the EIDL, and how does that apply to other loans and PPP, and how do those all work together?
Yeah. The EIDL does come with a $10,000 grant, so it sounds like they'd be under it. It would be granted. They wouldn't have to pay it back. But, again, everybody's situation is different. I would make sure I read the documents, and my advice would be to, if you have any questions at all, check with your attorney, have them review the contract.
And for the PPP, came in, can the PPP loan for payroll purposes be on the 8-week time period after receiving the money, understanding that it will not be forgivable and subject to the interest rate charges?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand that question. You're saying...
Yeah, let me see. So can you please clarify again, is a business able to use the PPP loan for payroll purposes beyond the 8-week time period after receiving the dollars, understanding that it will not be forgivable and subject to the interest rate charges?
Yeah, because the PPP loan is essentially 2.5 months worth of payroll. So yes, it would go, beyond the 8 weeks. The 8 weeks is just the measurement date. And so from the day that the funds hit your account, that's when the clock starts ticking on the 8 weeks. After those 8 weeks is the measurement date where your full-time equivalent head count and payroll dollars need to be at least 75% of what it was on February 15th, 2020. That's the high-level roadmap for forgiveness. So if you maintained your payroll 8 weeks after you got the money to what it was on February 15th, you're headed down a good path for forgiveness.
Excellent. And Dave, so before the pandemic, I guess I will call it, kind of hit business and hit our lives, there was this sort of acceptance, maybe I'll say, of, members in offices that employees or team members that were, say, not quite technically savvy. It was sort of I don't use computers, or I don't do that. Or does that change now? Is that acceptance gone now? I mean, is it almost mandatory that this you have to be at least savvy enough to be able to work remotely now, because we really don't know when we're coming back?
Well, I think those individuals have certainly been challenged during this time, right? Anybody they may have been leaning on in the office to get some help, or how do they do different things like that, is gone away, right? So you're isolated at home, and you got to figure out how you connect to a webinar or a web meeting, or get to that document, or do VPN, or whatever it is. It's certainly challenged and created some unique opportunities for them to be learning. So I do think in some ways they've gotten better, and they can leverage it more effectively. But I think the reality of this whole situation between when this all really started to happen in March through the end of the year is going to shape us all differently as individuals, but certainly as organizations as well. So how do we adapt and learn from that? How do we get better? I think one of those things is going to be, hey, we got to have a more flexible workforce. We got to be able to be more productive, more effective, more fluid in the way we do work, wherever that may be from. And if Joey in sales is not able to do that and cut that very well, then I need to get him some help or figure out how I address that situation. But I think probably everyone's been forced to some degree to get better at it.
Forced, yeah, that's the key, right? Mitch, question for you, Commander. What is your opinion in how the sick pay works regarding the pay for 2 weeks up to 80 hours? If we have reduced the schedules of our full-time employees from 5 days to 3, and then she qualifies for isolation or quarantine for 2 weeks, do you think that we should still pay the 5 days each week under the sick pay rules, or should only 3 days be paid? Did you get that?
There's more than a mouthful of question earlier. Mark, I saw you nod in your head. I don't want to call you out, but did you want to answer that as well, or?
Oh, no, no, no. I was nodding my head to follow Brent. So I think I got the gist of the question. I have no idea how to answer it.
I don't want to answer it either, Mitch.
So, Brent, that's
Complicated
my
question.
pay grade. What I'd like to do, though, is let's record who asked that question, and I can certainly reach out and follow up with an answer.
Okay, yeah, because that's a pretty complicated question. So that just one came in at 3:15 from anonymous. But if you could maybe send a chat or send Katie a message or even email us, whoever asked that question, we would be more than happy to put you in contact with Mitch, and we'll get that question answered, because it is pretty complex with how you're going to take a look at that sick leave based upon the adjusted schedule for, say, the part-time or the, how that employee has to work versus what you're kind of legally supposed to do based upon full-time 80-hour-a-week schedules, and if that's modified or not. So it's pretty complicated. But definitely feel free to shoot us that, and we'll get it over to Mitch.
Gladly give guidance. If I have to work through that, I think the steam will come out of my ears.
Right. Well, it looks like we got through the questions. So everybody, again, who was able to make it today, as well as our three panelists, David, Mark, Mitch, thank you very much for everyone's time. It was an absolute pleasure to be able to moderate today. And like I said, expect messages from us. We'll get more out there. There's a lot of content, I think, that's left to be covered. And hopefully we can do another one of these again. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye now.
Thank you.